Hello, everyone. My name is Prateep Nayak, and I'm one of the organizers of this particular session, which is titled as Prospects of Small-Scale Fisheries Transitioning from Vulnerability to Viability. Um, we will be listening to a number of presentations that are going to be linked to the notion of vulnerability to viability in small-scale fisheries, which means, how do we understand vulnerability in small-scale fisheries contexts and communities, and what are the methods, techniques, approach, and how can it be possible for small-scale fisheries to transition from their vulnerable situation to viability situations. And we are all part of a global partnership of vulnerability to viability in small-scale fisheries, which we call B2V Global Partnership. And the sequence of presentations are going to be exactly the same as they appear on the program. There are a number of, all presenters are here, but there are a number of presenters that have provided us with a recording of their presentations, which we will play. And then once the presentations are over, we will keep a bit of time at the end to audience question and answers. But following each of the presentations, if you have a quick follow-up question, then feel free to write it in the question and answer, or chat box. Okay. Our first presenter today is Alicia Robinson, who is a graduate student in the University of Waterloo, and we're going to play her presentation, which is don't have the title ready with me, but we'll move on to her presentation right away.
So mangroves are incredibly important for the millions of small-scale fishing communities who depend on them for their livelihoods, as they support the vast stocks of fish, shrimp, and crab that are necessary for communities to have a stable income and food supply. As a coastal ecosystem, mangroves also protect communities from the impacts of erosion, natural disasters, and climate change. These communities live in congruence with the mangroves and are completely dependent on them for their livelihoods and local economies. However, mangrove dependent small scale fishing communities are vulnerable to a multitude of threats. The wrath of colonialism and commercialization has destroyed over half of all mangrove stands and has left so many communities poverty stricken and politically excluded from decision making on resource management and poverty alleviation. Despite these huge and incredibly unjust threats that mangrove-dependent small-scale fisheries are vulnerable to, the current survivability of so many communities indicates that there must be strategies in place to cope and adapt to these drivers of change. However, it is poorly understood how communities can make this transition from vulnerability to viability. My research addresses this gap using a social-ecological systems approach, which accounts for the fact that social well-being cannot be separated from ecological well-being. Overall, my research goal is to gain understanding of this linkage between mangrove-dependent small-scale fisheries and viability, and to assess how communities and mangrove ecosystems can transition from vulnerability to viability as a social-ecological system, or SES. To meet this goal, I follow two objectives. First, I will present understanding of the current social ecological state of the system from the research participants' point of view by describing the magnitude and impacts of drivers of change and vulnerabilities in the SES. Second, I describe key response strategies and conceivable pathways to achieve viability in the SES. This research was comprised of a case study in Bangladesh, which is one of the global leading producers and exporters of fish. Small-scale fishers in Bangladesh face a myriad of vulnerabilities that are linked to poverty, low literacy, social neglect, and very high exposure to the impacts of tropical cyclones. Within Bangladesh, a case study consisting of household surveys and a focus group discussion was conducted within 3 villages in the Sundarbans mangrove forest. These 3 case study locations are shown here from left to right and are Demuria, Shakbara, and Kayabanya. Between all these cases, Demuria is the most vulnerable. There's very poor road infrastructure and transportation. There is an embankment in the community that is failing more and more day by day. And when it falls apart, the entire community will be flooded. Shockborough, the second case study site, is still very vulnerable, but there is slightly better infrastructure and transportation. And there is also more involvement of women in fisheries and income generation. The third case study location was chosen because it has the formation of a local institution within the community, which has addressed some of the vulnerabilities that this community experiences. So in the case studies, we asked participants to describe the drivers of change that they experience and the impacts that occur in response to these changes, with the goal of understanding how vulnerability is experienced in their particular context. This figure here shows the dynamics and feedback loops that occur between the drivers of change and impacts that the participants described. Impacts are shown in the solid filled cells, and the purple, pink, and blue color refer to impacts on different dimensions of the well-being of the fisherfolk. The blank text boxes outlined in purple and green respectively represent anthropogenic and natural drivers. Some cells have blue text, which indicates that these are proximate drivers that have direct impacts on the system, and other cells have red text, which indicates that these are underlying drivers that are rooted in social and institutional interactions. For example, unsustainable fishing practices were identified as a major threat by research participants. But if we look at the interactions in this figure, we can see that the reason that these practices exist at such a capacity is because fishers are just responding to a lack of access to resources and are attempting to cope. Corruption is also strongly linked to unsustainable practices, as government actions fuel corruption and facilitation of unsustainable fishing. These dynamics and feedback loops prove that when government actions ignore social dynamics, this can lead to a vicious cycle of negative impacts, where the current restrictions that harm fisher livelihoods leads to unsustainable harvesting that degrades resources even more and reinforces this view that communities are not able to manage resources from their local level, and this subsequently leads to further restrictions being put in place and catalyzing this cycle even more. The previous results that I presented mapped out the current state of vulnerability in the SES. Now I will move on to the results that pertain to the second research objective, which aims to understand key response strategies and conceivable pathways to achieve viability. So during the household surveys, the research team asked participants what changes they thought were needed in their communities. Participants were then asked what barriers are preventing these changes from occurring. They shared that they are severely limited in their ability to develop viability due to an unsupportive governance regime, a lack of education, and degrading social value within the community. We then asked participants what they think needs to be implemented to mitigate these barriers. From this information, I identified key actions that prioritize deep and strengthening work at the community level and mobilize these needed changes from the root up. These key actions that are shown here describe the bottom-up, systems-oriented work that is integral to the pathway to social-ecological viability. The first is that there needs to be education and awareness building that is led by community members so that it is context-specific to that particular community. The second is that there should be clear rules and boundaries within the community on who, where, how, and what people can harvest from the mangrove resources. These rules and boundaries should be created by the people of the community based on their extensive knowledge of the ecosystem. The third is that there should be effective monitoring of such rules and boundaries within the community. The current management system of the government enforcing restrictions is not working effectively, and since the well-being of mangrove-dependent fisherfolk is so deeply rooted in the mangrove ecosystem, there are very strong incentives for fishers to effectively monitor the mangroves, as these are the people who are most impacted by rule breaking. The fourth action is the formation of local institutions within the community. One strong adaptive response that one of the case study communities, Banya, has implemented is the formation and activities of a community-based organization, or CBO. This is a relatively new organization, but it has implemented several strategies to support the adaptive capacity of the community and promote well-being. A major focus is education, where community members that are more educated provide context-specific training on building skills so that people can learn to earn an alternative livelihood source during the times that they are not allowed in the mangroves. There's also training on sustainable fishing methods to educate people on the consequences of unsustainable practices, and there are rules in place and monitoring to prevent members from engaging in these unsustainable practices. Members also have access to receiving loans with low interest rates to provide immediate short-term relief, while they also engage in the organization's strategies to build long-term adaptive capacity. Finally, this organization offers a very small communication linkage between government officials and fisher folk to try to help villagers receive the subsidies that they are supposed to be getting during times of heavy government restriction, but often do not receive. This organization is an excellent example of how a community can organize and facilitate these three previous actions in the community from the root level. The fifth action is proper support and collaboration from the government to fully mobilize viability. Even if communities are able to enforce the first four actions shown here at the community level, it will be difficult to make much progress towards viability if the current governance regime maintains the same level of top-down control. So to conclude this presentation, I would just like to discuss what these results actually mean. First, community-based organizing is critical to the pathway to social-ecological viability. The example in Keabunia provides a case of how the formation of a local institution can mobilize key elements of the pathway to viability. However, one major component missing in Keabunia is that there really isn't any support or collaboration from the government. This reinforces that even if communities are able to organize and strengthen practices at the local level, there's really only so much that can be done, as there also needs to be systemic action within the government to mitigate corruption, facilitate institutional linkages, and support management decentralization. Management processes need to prioritize the perspectives and knowledge of local resource users, and this process begins with first listening to communities to gain a bottom-up understanding of social ecological dynamics before engaging in any decision-making practices. That concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. This slide here just shows photo credits to the two wonderful research assistants who collaborated in this work and also took all the photos that I show in this slide. So Tamim and Zahid, as well as collaboration from Dr. Sumia Salim and from the University of Liberal Arts in Bangladesh, who was very integral to the data collection in this work. Again, thank you for listening, and that's all I have for you. So thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks very much to Alicia. I think Alicia was not able to join us today, but she sent the recording of her presentation. But we'll move on to the next presentation, which is by Dr. Amrita Sen from the Indian Institute of Technology. And I know Amrita's presentation is going to be on the Sundarbans. We'll listen to Amrita now.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Hello? Okay. Yeah.
Yes, Amrita, we can hear you.
Just once. So thank you, everyone. Our presentation is entitled, Customary Norms and Folk Ecologies, Reflections from Artisanal Maritime Practices in the Indian Sundarbans. And we are doing a joint presentation from the IIT Kharagpur team. And since I'm presenting today, so I have been involved on the field work in the Indian Sundarban area for my PhD for quite some time now, and because of the ongoing projects like V2B as well. And so primarily I will be sharing a bit of my PhD work here today along with our ongoing work on V2B and other works on Sundarban. So primarily, I would be talking about the fishing practices along with some of the social complexities, putting it into a political ecology, into a framework of political ecology. Yeah. So Sundarbans is the largest stretch of the global littoral mangrove forests, and it is declared as an UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1987 for its very unique physical attributes, the range of wildlife, biodiversity, and different kinds of aquatic resources. So we all know about the Royal Bengal tiger, which is one of the flagship wildlife species in the region. And the speciality of this region is that Sundarbans extends, the mangroves extend across the two countries of Bangladesh and India. So it is in a very important geopolitical boundary. And the Indian part where we are largely working, it is known as the Sundarban Biosphere Reserve, which covers an area of approximately 9,630 square kilometers. But we feel that what is actually little known is the fact that the Indian Sundarbans also has a large stretch of human habitations, which occupies almost half of this 9,630 square kilometers, as you can see partly in the map. And these inhabited areas fall within the districts of the North and South 24 Parganas in West Bengal, occupying 19 blocks within these two districts. And a large number of people, particularly from the forest adjoining islands, depends largely on the forests for their livelihoods. And as you can see in the right-hand side, the red marked areas are the areas which are largely forest adjoining, and I had primarily worked here for the years of my own PhD. So although the region is vulnerable, there have been some overarching questions which had been raised through a range of very prolific academic literature on conservation politics on which I had worked. And one of the central concerns that intrigued me was how these vulnerable ecologies shape claims to resources and how such ecologies also shape material relations as well as different kinds of human identities. Now, the question is why political ecology? Political ecology largely because it is an analytical framework which foregrounds issues of power asymmetries, inequities, and social injustice amidst nature. And I have also, to a large extent, aimed to understand how the prevailing conservation norms in the area affect existing social and institutional structures, underpinning these forest livelihoods into a large political realm. And in doing that, I conceptually foreground issues of power asymmetries, inequities, and social injustice as major imperatives in framing explorations on forest conservation politics in India, moving beyond discourses which see conservation as strictly defined by the state or those that rely on a very simplistic portrayal of local communities. There are certain structural socialities which make the inhabited landscape a very unique context of exploration because we always felt that there is a very unique politics of belongingness that can be traced across the region, since the entire community that is inhabiting the Indian Sundarbans are migrants. And the population, they largely belong to three categories: the scheduled castes, the scheduled tribes, and the other backward castes. And there is also a minuscule of Christians and Muslims. Mostly from Bangladesh, but also from different adjoining regions like Midnapur, Jharkhand, Bihar, and Orissa. One very specific social organization that Anu Jalai also explores exhaustively in her fascinating book, The Forest of Tigers, is that since the entire population belongs to lower caste orders, social status is not that much determined by caste, but it is majorly determined by land locations, land structure, and the nature of occupation in all these islands, because we largely see that people staying near to the forest are considered as lacking any kind of material culture. And here, something that is also very contextual is the fact that she mentions that the forest neighborhoods and the forest related livelihood practices are materially shunned by the local elites, because in the larger hierarchy of the geographical locations, they believe that the worst place that one could settle in are in the peripheries of the forest adjoining islands. So a large part of my work is directly focused on the forest-based livelihood survival crisis and the politics of belonging in these landscapes. And we can see that harvesting crabs, fishing, and prawn seed collection are the three main fishing livelihoods along the forested creeks and the rivers of the Tiger Reserve. And they also involve very discrete locations, because we can see that while catching crabs, so there is a definite lunar circle that is followed, and the forest fishers are seen to be entering the narrowest creeks within the forests, which are inundated during the high tides and they are almost dry during the low tides. Fishing occurs in the creeks, but also in the main river bodies, apart from a few fish species that are found in the creeks. And prawn seed collection, which is an extremely predominant occupation over there. The prawn seeds are majorly caught along the river banks with pulling nets. And in many cases, we can see that the fishers have to travel at least a day to reach the particular spot, the fishing location, and the entire trip lasts for at least 7 to 14 days. Prawn seeds, it is a very local, prawn seed collection is a very local occupation. Prawn seeds can be caught while pulling the fishing nets along the banks of the river or from a boat. And we can see that fishing primarily occurs from June to the end of October. Nets and gears are known by different local names like Galsha, Beundi, Katadon, Khapla, Khalpata, Charpata. These are all local names. And one of the uniqueness of many of these gears are the discrete uses depending on the nature of the khal or the forest creek. So as you can see, I think this is again something that is very commonly associated with the with the entire Sundarban. As you can see in the newspapers, every year tiger attacks claim a lot of lives, and in most of these cases, compensations are not granted because there is a larger political process that operates in this context. I'm not going into the details in the interest of time, but the larger politics of belongingness that I was talking in the beginning sums up a justification for many of these cases. As you can see in the picture, there are a large number of women, and these women are very commonly referred to as tiger widows. The forest workers very commonly believe that many deaths occurring in the core areas are not even reported, fearing hefty fines and abuse. And such deaths cannot even be mourned publicly in the villages. And most of the times, the bodies of the deceased are abandoned to the tiger. And even if an accident happens, accident is a local term that they use to refer to tiger attacks. So even if an accident happens in the buffer areas, and even if the dead body can be recovered, the family has to go through a series of essentially very, very complex methods to claim compensation. And in most of the cases, establishing the case of death is extremely difficult, since the forest guards accompany the companions of the deceased to locate the place of the accident, but mostly in an atmosphere of suspicion. The deaths which occur in the core areas are not only unrecognized, but they are in most of the cases refused by the forest department. However, there are certain livelihood practices which even if being unsustainable, are widely practiced because they work through distinct relations of power. In this case, contrary to the other forms of forest work, we can see that rights can be legitimated, and one such occupation is the prawn seed collection, harvesting, and the setting up of prawn fisheries, which poses very critical challenges to the ecology, as we all know. Nevertheless, these occupations persist as key practices of livelihood. So my ethnography in my recent book on prawn harvesting in the villages provides an engaging political ecology account on the ways in which powerful and autonomous voices predominate in the making and legitimation of local claims to livelihoods. This is just a glimpse of our ongoing work that we are doing. So we have completed a couple of short visits to the area, and a glimpse of our ongoing work in several forest fringe villages of the Sundarban shows that, and we are also trying to do this, we are trying to attempt a much needed transition from the theoretical understanding that we have got through the very critical literature review that has been done, that is being done right now, to tangible actions through integrated planning and implementation of locally tuned initiatives and programs, such as training workshops, field schools, knowledge mobilization activities, and different kinds of innovations and innovative plans. So so this is just a picture from a recent visit where we are collaborating with the local NGO, SJSM, and this is a village that is in the Goshaba block, the Tipli area. Yeah, so that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Amrita. and we will have questions. I don't see any questions, but I would remind all the attendees, if you have any follow-up quick questions, you can ask that question immediately following the presentations. Other than that, we will have a chunk of time at the end of all our presentations for questions from the audience itself. So there will be time. Okay, so we will then move on to our next presentation, which is by Dr. Ana Carolina Estevez Diaz. Ana is from the University of Waterloo, and she is an integral part of Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership. And Ana's presentation is titled as, I would just read it out to you, Uncovering Wellbeing Ecosystem Services Bundles Under Conditions of Social-Ecological Changes. Over to you, Ana.
Hello, this presentation focuses on uncovering well-being ecosystem services bundles, what we call WEBs, under conditions of socio-ecological changes. This is part of my PhD thesis at the University of Waterloo in Canada, and that was based, the fieldwork was based in fishing communities in Brazil. So an overview of the talk, I'll talk about coastal ecosystems, ecosystem services, and social well-being. That is the main theoretical approach for this research. I'll present a case study on coastal communities in Brazil, discuss highlight two different well-being ecosystem services bundles that were the highlights of the research. We'll talk about these pathways of interaction, so how people gain well-being from nature, how that happens, what we call the pathways, and some of the key insights on these 4 different pathways. So I'd like to start this presentation with a photo of a fishing community. These, you can see 2 different canoes, and like one canoe and one boat coming together to grab the net. This is a seine fishing net. And they come, they leave the net for some time. The fish, they go in, but they cannot go out. So you can see that they are still alive. This type of fishing preserves the fish alive. So if they need to release juveniles, for example, it's possible. And they usually come together as a group, the fishers. They are either friends or family. They have a lot of interaction throughout the fishing itself. Sometimes they bring their kids to learn how to fish, or to see how their family operates in the sea. And this is very social type of work as well. And thinking about that, why we are talking about social well-being ecosystem services. So once we think about fishing, fishing provides income and food security for many families that is related to standards of living or material well-being. Fishing also have a lot of the social interactions, connections between friends, between family members. So there's a very strong relational component to fisheries. And fisheries also is related to life satisfaction, or related to how people feel good about themselves, or also related to their own perception and identity. So these are more subjective dimensions of fisheries. And thinking about these 3-dimensional aspects of well-being that ecosystem services can provide to people, in this case, fisheries, we understand that the social well-being concept is important to be aggregated and integrated into the ecosystem services literature for us to understand how people obtain this well-being from nature. And this is the basis for this diagram, the well-being ecosystem services bundles, that are sets of ecosystem services that are tightly associated with improvements in social well-being of a given community. So this is the focus of the presentation of today. And to explain this theoretical background, I would like to bring a case study that is from Ubatuba. It's a city in the southeast coast of Brazil. You can see here that there is a lot of vegetation still in the area. This area is still very well preserved with the Atlantic forest. And fisheries, the canoes, they're part of the culture. So local people, they understand themselves, they identify themselves as Kaisara people. Kaisara people, they live off of small-scale agriculture, small-scale fisheries. In the past, hunting. Today, hunting is prohibited, and tourism is replacing some of the livelihoods of local communities. And this is very strong in their culture still. And here, I would like to highlight that this work was also part of discussions with the communities. They were very crucial, and most of the insights came from discussions with them. There are other researchers that was part of this research as well, from Canada, from the University of Waterloo, as well as from Brazil, mostly from the University of Campinas, and peers and colleagues that collaborated throughout the understanding of the data, but also planning for the field work. And this is a very collaborative research. So the empirical context then is the municipality of Ubatuba in the state of São Paulo, that is highlighted here in the map. And we talked with 3 different communities, Puruba, Almada, and Pissinguaba. And these 3 communities are Caiçara communities. They share a lot of culture and similarities, and their main source of income is fishing and also tourism and other types of activities in the area as well. So here's some photos of these communities. So the first photo shows a canoe and fishing gear that is drying in the sun. So this is usually their houses by the beach, or they have just this place where they store their boats and their fishing gear. And the photo in the middle, it's wooden pieces. So they use these wooden pieces, they boil it, and then they dip the fishing net into that boiling water, and that the wood will release some chemicals that will help to preserve the net. And the third photo is cassava. So cassava is a type of root that they grow in small scale agriculture. And something that is very interesting, there's some families, they grow cassava, and other families, they go out fishing. And sometimes in the same family, they do both, but they exchange products. So people that produce cassava, they produce the flour, and then they exchange cassava flour for fish and vice versa. So these are some aspects of local livelihoods. And for this research, we focused on a few key questions. So what are some of the core contributions that coastal ecosystems provide to fishing communities? And how communities receive such contribution? What is the pathways? How they incorporate these contributions in their lives? And we used 3 different methods for this research. First, we conducted a household survey. Then we conducted Photovoice. So here are some of the photos that came out from the Photovoice activity. So Photovoice is a method that you ask participants to provide pictures related to the research question. In this case, what are some of the aspects of coastal ecosystems that provide them with well-being? And we discuss about the pictures. What are some of the main feelings that emerge when you look to the pictures, what the picture itself represents, and we have a rich discussion. And final method was a participatory workshops. Actually, we conducted 3 workshops, one in each community. And then during the workshop, we had someone capturing the key messages and putting together in a panel. So you can see the outcome of this graphic facilitation, how we call this process here, one for each community. Very interesting is that the communities, they kept this graphic outcome, and they took to local schools to discuss with kids about their culture, about the importance of fishing the communities, and about how people perceive themselves as Kaisara. So what are some of these contributions that coastal ecosystems provide to coastal communities? Here is a summary of what we found. So first, you can see the different dimensions of well-being, for example, safety, livelihoods, cultural identity, and then how they connect to different ecosystem services. That is the middle column here. And what are some of the drivers of change affecting the ecosystem services, and in turn, also affecting well-being, both positive and negative. For instance, protected areas, they are preserving, they're helping to preserve native vegetation, which in turn improves safety. And I will explain a little bit more this bundle. On the other hand, protected areas are affecting local livelihoods negatively as well, because they're areas that are set aside for conservation, that you cannot fish or you cannot hunt. So this negatively affect a local culture, some local livelihoods. So this interplay is something that is very interesting and rich once we talk to local people. So I'd like to highlight two main webs for this presentation. So the first one is the dimension of well-being, that is safety, that is connected to coastal ecosystems, mainly vegetation. So if this is a photo of one of the communities, you can see that there's a lot of mountains around, still very preserved. The forest is very preserved. And what fishermen told me is that they perceive that once there is deforestation, an area that they clear land to build houses or other things, they perceive that there are landslides. So they observe landslides happening, and landslides may cause losses, material losses, even losses of life in the communities, so that they say that they feel safe once they see that the forest is preserved. And where in areas where they see land clearly, land that is being cleared, they feel unsafe because they know that a landslide may happen in that area. So this is one aspect of safety. And another aspect of safety is that due to these mountain chains, the access to the community is more restricted, so that local people feel safe because they know everyone in the community, and they see that there's less robbery because people, it's very hard for people to go there and leave very fast because of the difficulty of access. So these are two different components of safety and how coastal well-being, coastal ecosystem services provide this feeling of safety to local community. And second, webs that I would like to highlight is how social and political relations, which means the relational aspect of well-being, is improved by fisheries and canoes. And this was very interesting to see how canoes provide this political arena for local people, where they discuss important political discussions with marine protected areas, for example, with the government. They discuss cultural aspects that are very important for them, and how they can secure their livelihoods in face of tourism, for example. And here I put a quote from a Photovoice activity. So this is a photo that shows a canoe race. Canoe race is an event that is very traditional for Caiçara people. And this fisherman told me that we maintain this old tradition, which is the canoe race. It also includes dancing, being with friends, discussing important issues for us. The canoe race is the event that brings people from our culture together for different purposes, and we feel this need. So this is how a lot of cultural reproduction as well, social interactions. And here's another quote from a canoe as well, that the canoe represents fishing. The canoe is also an object. It is also a fishing equipment. It represents leisure, competition, and our right to come and go. The canoe is the root of Caiçara people. So this is another quote that shows how the canoe is a symbol of social relations and local culture. And fishing as well. So here is a photo of mullet fishing. So the mullet, they are being dried in the sun. So they open the fish, they put the salt, and they let it dry in the sun. And this fisherman was saying that mullet fishing is a family fishing in which everyone who helps gets a fair share. So this is what my family represents: sharing, trusting, and a sense of community. And going over all these discussions and the disconnections between well-being and ecosystem services, we started to ask ourselves how the communities then receive such contributions, how it happens, through which means, which of the human senses is that the case. And then we observed that first, once we go back to the safety component, the safety webs, we see that observations is a way that people perceive and feel well-being from ecosystem services. Once they observe where the forest is very well preserved, they can feel safe, there's no landslides, that brings them a feeling of safety. So this is how an observational pathway. But on the other hand, fisheries, for example, or canoeing or paddling, they are experiential activities. So they experience the activities and they have a sense of well-being. For example, when they say that fishing brings them peace of mind, and fishing is a mental hygiene. I'm quoting another fisher that was mentioning about fishing activities, and also the canoe race is a leisure activity. So this is how they experience an activity that brings them well-being. Fisheries also has an extractive component to it. So fisheries is an activity that you extract a resource from nature, and that brings you nutrition, that brings you food security, that brings you at other types of well-being that are connected to the extractive nature of fisheries. And also visual. So once you can contemplate nature and once you see a landscape that brings you happiness, that brings you this feeling of being connected, or that brings you an aesthetic value. So this is how visually you receive or you perceive this well-being coming from ecosystem services. So in sum, I would like to highlight that we have different webs. These webs, they are very context specific. However, how they are perceived is something that we can extrapolate to elsewhere areas as well. So these different dimensions of webs and how people perceive well-being from nature, these different pathways, they can be understood as something that happens in different places, and the cultural and subjective dimensions of coasts are key to governance, because people that are involved in the conservation efforts, they are being affected by regulations. They perceive these in different ways that is not necessarily in the same way that people that are managing a protected area, for example, perceive. So once you create a strategy, a conservation strategy that will either restrict or allow a specific type of activity, or they regulate some type of behaviors, local people, they may experience that culturally, socially, subjectively, as well as in material sense. So this is something to take into consideration and to improve governance of coastal areas as well. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Anna. And if there are any immediate follow-up questions for Anna, we can take that up now, or please keep your questions to the end. We will now move on to our next presenter, who is Emily Filinska from the University of Waterloo. Emily's the title of her talk is The Complex Reality of Cetacean Bycatch and Fisher-Cetacean Relationships. And I will invite now Emily to make her presentation.
Hello, I'm Emily Filinska, and this is my presentation on the complex reality of cetacean bycatch and fisher-cetacean relationships. We will start off with a short introduction, followed by the methodology. Then we will look at the results and discussions of objectives 1, 2, and 3 of this research, and we will end with some concluding ideas as well as directions for future research. Let's start with our introduction. Populations around the globe are growing, and this has caused an increased demand for food, such as fish. This increased demand for fish has led to overfishing as well as overexploitation of fish stocks. Overfishing has increased competition for fisheries resources, and this is especially concerning for small-scale fisheries and their fishers whose lives directly depend on the fish that they catch. However, there's also increased interactions between small-scale fishery fishers and cetaceans, which are dolphins, whales, and porpoises. They are especially connected as fishers and coastal cetaceans tend to depend on the same resources as well as habitat. These increased interactions can increase chances of bycatch. Bycatch is typically defined as the incidental capture of non-target species, where incidental means that the action was unavoidable, and non-target species can include cetaceans, sea turtles, seabirds, and any other species that are not the target catch of the fishery. Now we will talk about the methodology used for this research. A transdisciplinary as well as social-ecological systems perspective were both really important concepts used to guide this research, especially when trying to look at bycatch impacts on the natural, social, and governing systems, as well as really trying to understand fisher-cetacean relationships and what impacts them. The research question investigated was, how can vulnerabilities of both cetaceans and small-scale fishery fishers be assessed and common strategies for their viability be developed? There were 3 research objectives investigated for this thesis. The first was to understand the nature and extent of cetacean bycatch within the social-ecological system, which in this case was the small-scale fishery. The second objective was to examine how differing levels of cetacean bycatch add to the vulnerabilities of the social-ecological system by focusing on A, cetacean bycatch impacts on the natural subsystem, and B, its impacts on the social subsystem. And the third objective of this research was to determine a set of mitigative and adaptive strategies that are most likely to increase social-ecological viability through appropriate cetacean bycatch governance. 3 main methods were used to complete this research. The first was a literature review as well as policy analysis. The second was multi-stakeholder surveys with small-scale fishery fishers, with 50 surveys being completed in the Chilliwack Lagoon case study. Following this, there were also semi-structured interviews completed with key bycatch experts, and 10 interviews were completed in total. Chilliwack Lagoon was chosen because of its unique fisher-cetacean relationship, where fishers actually cooperatively fished with the Irrawaddy dolphins in this area, specifically the outer channel, as that is the preferred habitat of the Irrawaddy dolphin. Now we will look at the results and discussion of the first objective of this research. It was clear that the nature and extent of cetacean bycatch is actually very context-specific and really depends on local conditions. However, we did find that fisher-cetacean relationships are extremely important to take into consideration, especially because whether or not fishers care about and value cetaceans can really impact their conservation. And it was really interesting to learn that how bycatch is managed actually really impacts fisher-cetacean relationships. In the Chilliwack Lagoon case study, fishers consider cetacean bycatch to be extremely rare, with some fishers even saying that bycatch of the Irrawaddy dolphin does not happen in Chilliwack Lagoon. However, still with these rare bycatch events, we did see clear social linkages as well as governance obstacles, where fishers experience both mental and material well-being impacts of bycatch, as well as fishers really notice in Chilliwack Lagoon that dolphin bycatch can impact their livelihoods. However, fishers in Chilliwack Lagoon really lack the institutional support that they need to be able to actively manage bycatch, as well as lacking the power to actually have a voice in decision-making on how bycatch is managed. And this is especially true as there is no supportive bycatch policies currently in place in Chilliwack Lagoon. Now we will move on to the results and discussion of Objective 2. For the second objective of this research, we found that the natural subsystem impacts of bycatch are unclear, as it is hard to differentiate what impacts on the natural subsystem are from bycatch alone. However, the social subsystem impacts of bycatch are much more clear, especially in the Chilliwack Lagoon case study. We also found that fisher perspectives must be incorporated in how bycatch is defined, how it's managed, as well as in any creation of bycatch policies. This is because we found a disconnect between the belief of fishers and key experts on what bycatch is. Specifically, that fishers still consider an economically viable species to be bycatch. However, key experts really emphasize that in order for a species to be bycatch, it cannot be economically viable and it must be discarded. This disconnect is important to take into consideration as key experts tend to be the ones informing policies as well as other decision making. So with this disconnect, it is clear that fisher perspectives are very important to take into consideration. We also found that there could be a connection between areas with high levels of cetacean bycatch and the occurrence of IUU fishing, specifically by the way that they're managed, especially if there is top-down management taking place which causes banning or forbidding actions, as well as if there was miscommunication or no communication with fishers and local communities. This is interesting to take into consideration as maybe we could manage both bycatch and IUU with similar management strategies. Now we will move on to the third objective of this research. We found that cetacean bycatch management must be adaptive, as mitigative strategies are not enough to tackle the problem of bycatch. Cetacean bycatch governance must be both interactive and adaptive, as fishers need access to power as well as institutional support to be able to manage bycatch. We really need to actively collaborate with fishers on technologies and any adaptive strategies for management. For the Chilliwack Lagoon case study, fishers know the role that they play in management and governance of bycatch, however, they lack the institutional support to do so. We will now end with some concluding ideas as well as discussions for future research. Even with bycatch being rare in the Chilliwack Lagoon case study, there are clear social and governance obstacles faced by fishers, which does impact the conservation of cetaceans. Social-ecological linkages of bycatch and how it's managed need to be further investigated in the future, especially since this research took place during the COVID pandemic, which did shut down fisheries, which could have impacted the results of this study. Social and adaptive governance solutions also need to be further investigated, incorporating the opinions and perspectives of small-scale fisheries fishers. The bycatch definition also needs to be adapted, however, work needs to be done with both policymakers and fishers in order to implement bycatch policies in all countries. Furthermore, there needs to be ongoing monitoring and analysis of any type of adaptive bycatch management strategy, as well as cetacean bycatch governance, to see if these are being effective not only at reducing the amount of bycatch, but also at improving the livelihoods of fishers as well as their mental and material well-being. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and if you have any questions or any information you'd like to share with me, please do not hesitate to email me at the email in this slide. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Emily. And Emily is here to answer any questions or discuss if you have any points to discuss with her at the end of our other presentations. So we will now move on to our next presentation, which is by Ruel Mia. And Ruel's title of his talk is Impacts of COVID-19 Pandemic on Market Access in Mud Crab Fishery in Bangladesh. Over to Ruel.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining our presentation today. Again, my name is Mohammad Ruel Mia, and I'm a PhD student in the School of Environment, Enterprise and Development at the University of Waterloo. My supervisor is Professor Dr. Prateep Nayak. Today, I'm going to talk about the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic on access to markets for small-scale fisheries through a case study in Bangladesh. This research was undertaken as part of my master's thesis at the Memorial University of Newfoundland. I will begin with a brief overview of the importance of small-scale fisheries and its trade before presenting the methods and results of my study. Fish and fish-related products are one of the most traded seafood commodity globally, where a significant portion of fish and fish-related products are coming from the small-scale fisheries. Small-scale fisheries are increasingly gaining importance in the domestic and international market chains. They're connecting traders, distributors, and consumers worldwide. While the majority of the fishers are men, a major workforce in the fish supply chain consists of women. Women comprise around 70 to 80% of post-harvest processing activities. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals recognizes the importance of small-scale fisheries by including in SDG 14, which is SDG 14B, that speaks about securing access for small-scale fisheries, access to market and resources. The recent outbreak of COVID-19 has affected small-scale fisheries and complicated their access to markets, and to a lesser extent, access to resources. To examine this impact, I conducted a case study in Bangladesh focusing on mud crab fishery. Mud crab is one of the most commercially important fishery in Bangladesh, which is abundantly found in the Sundarban mangrove forest. And this is one of the sector where women are almost equally involved with the men for harvesting crab. However, the mud crab chain is unstructured and operates without any government intervention, leaving suboptimal legal and policy conditions for the flow of fish trade. This study took place in Shamnagar Upazila in the Satkira district, which is located in the northwestern part of the Sundarbans mangrove forest. I conducted remote key informant interviews with around 20 individuals representing from different supply chain actors. A diverse group of actors are involved in the mud crab supply chains, including small-scale crab harvesters, post-harvest processors, collectors, crab fatteners, depot owners or others, exporters, and several government agencies, and each of them has specific roles in the supply chains. Some of them, the roles of some of the actors are overlapping in some cases. Additionally, two cooperative associations play key roles in the mud crab supply chains. One is the Association of Depot Owners, that is based in the local market, and the second one is the association that formed by the export traders based in the capital city, which is Dhaka in Bangladesh. The flow of market harvesters to consumers follows six main channels. The majority of the supply chain, which is around 98%, ends up with the foreign buyers, with about 65% following the long chain of buyers, collectors, and traders. As shown in the figure, depot owners are at the center of the market. They are connecting almost all the actors with supply chain except foreign buyers. The export traders are at the end of the market chain in Bangladesh. The export traders receive the maximum profit, that is 68% if we look at the profit margin for each of the actors, followed by the local depot owners, where the profit for small-scale fishers are the least. The standard price for all sizes of crab is set by the export trader at Uttara Dhaka, followed by the international market standards. If you look at the table, this is the international standard sizes that maintained by the crab exporters. All the exporters, they first set the buying prices considering different factors, including money exchange rate, market demand, sorting and grading, and domestic and export transportation cost. Each actor in the supply chain, except small-scale harvesters and farmers, are free to negotiate for better prices. Price negotiation does not apply to small-scale harvesters and farmers because they are financially tied to faria or depot owners who provide them money when they need. Market access in the market fishery is mainly governed by the exporters, with government agencies being involved in the regulatory aspects of the export trade. Foreign buyers let their requirements to be known to exporters, and all the supply chain actors are obliged to follow them. The depot owners and export traders, through their association, can deal with the issues related to their business, while small-scale harvesters, farmers, or farmers or women, they don't have such platform to raise their concerns. The crab supply chain is a male-dominated sector in Bangladesh, although women have a huge influence in the harvesting of crab. Often they get lower prices for their products than their male counterparts. If you look at the interaction between the actors, in most cases the interactions between the actors are related to credit support, price setting, and the quality of crab that require certificates for export trade. Crab harvesters form a trust agreement with depot owners, as I mentioned earlier, that they are tied to them for their monetary support. So they they have to sell their products to their money lenders at whatever prices they offers, and conflicts occurs based on this price setting sometimes. Since crab harvesters do not have bargaining power, they often get unfair prices for their products, as well as become most vulnerable to crab price fall in international markets. The foreign buyers do not compromise the quality of the crab. A few evidences observed that they had rejected the crab shipment from Bangladesh due to the presence of weak, dead, or broken crab. At the harvest level, sometimes the income for crab harvesters is affected when forest officials illegally ask for extra money to allow harvesters to enter into the forest. Similar kind of thing also observed at the export level. Well, the export traders argue that they sometimes need to pay extra money to obtain no objection certificate on time. While crab harvesters already confront many difficulties with the supply chain, the outbreak of COVID-19 and the subsequent lockdown and mobility restrictions have further affected their access to markets. According to 85% of the research participants, the income per small-scale harvesters has declined due to the pandemic. Additionally, 40% of the key informants noted that crab harvesters have a lack of alternative income opportunities. The pandemic has further reduced women's ability to contribute to family and personal income since they could not harvest crab during this time. The pandemic effects on market access and income have exacerbated food security problems because families can no longer afford to eat well. So, what are the policy implications and lessons learned from this study? The existing credit system plays the biggest role in restricting small-scale fishers' ability to get good prices and also access to market. In the absence of formal structure governing the market, powerful traders are free to dominate decision-making in crab trades. The crab harvesters, including women, have no influence on the structure and governance of the market. Small-scale fishers have little knowledge or power in navigating domestic or international markets. So our study suggests that the market for market fishery offers little opportunity to foster human rights and dignity. A gap is clearly existing in implementing the relevant principles of small-scale fisheries guidelines suggest. Overall, the effects of the pandemic have highlighted how small-scale fisheries lack agency and power in access and decision-making around markets for the market fishery. The differences in the vulnerabilities and challenges that small-scale fisheries face around the world due to COVID-19 suggest that there is no one response that will fit all. So here are the recommendations based on the analysis of the findings of my study. This study suggests developing strategies and/or policies to overcome the existing market supply chain challenges and improve the market access for small-scale fisheries. Government, first of all, should facilitate small-scale fisheries non-discriminatory access to collective decision-making related to local, national, and international markets. Policies need to align with sustainability goals as well as objectives and principles in the small-scale fisheries guidelines. This is indeed important for the countries like Bangladesh to improve market structure, price setting, and credit support by making policies and ultimately putting steps towards achieving SDG 14B. A better understanding of the market structure and local level governance is required to strengthen small-scale fisheries organization and capacity to participate in the supply chain. Countries like Bangladesh should diversify the market by introducing and regulating the domestic markets rather than depending only on a few export markets, helping to build a stronger resilience to future market disruption like COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, I would like to acknowledge the funding authority of this study. This research was undertaken thanks in part to funding from the Canada First Research Excellence Fund through the Ocean Frontier Institute. And I would be happy to answer any questions if you have in our next section. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Well. Excellent presentation. We'll move on to the next presentation by Vandana now, Vandana Bharati. And the presentation title from Vandana is COVID-19 Footprints and Coastal Sustainability During and Post-Pandemic, a Case Study of Chilika Lagoon.
Hello everyone, my name is Vandana and I am glad to share my research on this platform. So my research is about COVID-19 footprints and coastal sustainability during and post-pandemic. The case study is of Chilika Lagoon, India. So before moving to my research, I would like to put some insights on Chilika Lagoon. So it is Asia's largest brackish water lake. It is the biggest lagoon on India's eastern coast as well. It is well known for migrating birds. Also, it attracts many tourists and bird watchers during the season. Household survey was conducted in Chilika Lagoon to understand the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic on small-scale fishers. This study was conducted in following dimensions, that is social, environmental, economic, and political. The short-term coping measures adapted by small-scale fishers, government institutions are also studied in this research. Along with that, there are some suggestions for long-term viability of small-scale fishers are discussed in the research. Looking at the social impacts, small-scale fishers considered COVID-19 as an unexpected health crisis, which limited their regular lifestyle, increased social gaps because they were not able to meet or gather in a group or small gatherings, community meetings, going for shopping, going for fishing, etc. They also faced food shortage in their houses. Their children were not able to go to school, they couldn't get the education during the pandemic. Also, because the classes were online and they were not able to afford smartphones for their study. Children were not able to go outside. They feel more restricted, which impacted their psychological well-being. Fishers not able to afford medical services during the pandemic. Also, due to lack of transportation in their village, they were not able to avail or to reach the medical centers or the health centers. Also, the natural calamities wasn't the situation during the pandemic. Cyclone Fani and Cyclone Amphan in 2019 and 2020 almost took away the floods during those, because of those cyclones, took away their equipment and also damaged their boats. For going for fishing again, fishers had to buy these equipment and boats again, but the government didn't pay any compensation to them. Also, the recreational activities such as tourism was closed during the pandemic, so they were not able to earn income from tourism as well. Due to restrictions, fish markets were closed, and also fishers were not able to go out for fish rearing and harvesting. They were not able to sell their catch. And also after the lift in small restrictions, if they were able to sell their catch, they couldn't get a fair price. The price was really less than the price they were used to get before pandemic. Coping measures were adapted by fisher folks, organizations, and the government for short-term viability during the pandemic period, such as fishers responded by maintaining peace and harmony among themselves. They did awareness campaigns to aware each other or the villagers. They cleaned the beaches. They practiced artisanal fishing methods only by using motorboats and traditional fishing. For their survival, they sold their properties, spent their savings, and also took loan, which seems as a short-term viability, but still it leads them towards a long-term viability. At institutional and government level, they stayed connected with them through social media and phones. They provide free ration supply or subsidized ration supply to the fisher folks. Also, government provides some cash support to the fisher communities. Here are some suggestions for long-term viability of fisher folks, which are analyzed during household surveys, such as they didn't want any kind of food insecurity during the pandemic. So during pandemic, they felt more insecure about food. There should not be any restrictions. They should be able to afford medical services. The price for diagnosis and treatment for them should be less so that they can afford it. There should be more health centers in the village so that they don't need any transportation to reach medical health centers. They're looking for new market strategies for selling their catch. It could be online selling or door-to-door selling, etc. Also, they're looking for increasing the secondary sources income in the village so that people do not have to migrate when situation is not worse. Finally, I would like to conclude that we are still not yet over from the pandemic. Gradually, we are becoming resilient to deal with the changes. And I believe that post-pandemic viability could be possible through learning and development process. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks, Vandana. We now move on to our last presentation by Dr. Samishta Patnaik from the Indian Institute of Technology in Mumbai. And the presentation title is Environmentalism and Environmental Justice in the Life, Livelihoods and Cultural Identity of Small-Scale Fisheries, Fishers in the Coastal Wetlands of India. Old stories, new analysis. We have about 14 minutes left. Sarvishta, if you could make your presentation within 10 minutes, we will have a few minutes for questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you very much, Prateep, and my sincere apology that I could just join because of some technical problem. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Sarmishta. I'm a faculty working in Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay, in India. And by training, I'm a sociologist. So let me just make it slide so mode. Prateep, are you able to see the slides?
Yes, but not the slides. So yes, now it is. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah. So as the title here, you can see that environmentalism and environmental justice in the life, livelihoods, and cultural identity of small-scale fishers in the coastal wetlands of India. So this is also based on the case study, as like the previous speaker, Ms. Vandana, she talked about in Chilika. So this is a presentation based on the conceptual as well as the empirical observations. So here in this presentation, I argue for a sociological understanding of social and environmental justice in the context of overfishing and aquaculture production in the global south. So my study here attempts to link the concept of environmentalism of the poor with the environmentalism of the dispossessed. So a concept which defines the vulnerability of small-scale fishers due to marginalization, ecological displacement, loss of cultural identity, and livelihood loss. So through this presentation, I examined the concept of, as I said, environmentalism of the poor, referring to John Martin's Allaire, with the wider notions of environmental justice, and argue that environmentalism of the poor concept opposes the post-materialist interpretation of environmentalism, as well as the idea that environmental risk is impartial to social class. So secondly, through my empirical observations on the post-ecological commons, I argue that environmentalism of the poor also manifests itself as an environmentalism of the dispossessed, referring to tempo, and this is due to marginalization, ecological displacement, and livelihood loss. So with this introduction, I'll discuss here very briefly the theoretical foundations around which the present study is undertaken, followed with a brief outline of the field, methods, the data, and the brief findings. So these are the broader objectives: to examine the manner by which the environmental justice emphasizes social justice concerns through the embracing of the poor, particularly in the global south and especially in India, and the claims made, and particularly for the local indigenous communities, how they defend their customary rights over the commons, particularly in the small-scale fisheries. And in order to address such concerns of environmental justice, this study also tries to examine the concept of environmentalism of the poor on commons and the communities. And this I have done from my long-term research in coastal fisheries, particularly in the wetlands of India in the Chilika Valley. So these are the broad research objectives. I am keen to investigate various research questions drawn on the basis of these arguments. Does environmentalism promote injustice for the poor? How marginalization small-scale producers, particularly the fishers in the coastal ecosystem, reflects the concern of justice framework which lies at the heart of environmentalism. How marginalization of fishers is labeled as environmentalism of the dispossessed, referring to harvest concept. And the last objective is whether the study could be cited as an example of, as the current sociological problems in SSF. This is particularly referring the panel's objective, the prospects for SSF transition from B to B. So this, on the basis of this theoretical framework, the study is based on. So to examine those questions, I engage with the literature, drawing on the concepts and theories for environmental justice, forms of environmentalism of the poor, and environmentalism of the dispossessed, referring to accumulation by disposition. So, coastal fisheries, particularly the small-scale fishers in India, they have been the setting ground of major struggles since the emergence of the global markets for marine products, and also particularly for the government policies for developing industrial fisheries. So from that particular perspective, small-scale fishery is a large rural sector, especially in Asia. So there are lots of works have already been done in the Indian context by John Curry and Martin Barwick and Dr. Nayak's own work also. So because of that, it provides jobs, livelihoods, food security, cultural identity to a large number of people. So on the basis of for this backdrop, in India, the coastal fisheries sector, my objective has been to examine how the various changes occur in the small-scale fisheries sector, with having major social and economic impacts, and how that results in the marginalization of small-scale fishers by creating environmental injustice and equity problems. To investigate this, I have chosen the field Chilika. So in the previous presentation also, the speaker presented about the lake and its importance. So here you can see that this Chilika Lagoon is a pier-shaped lake. It is over 5,000 years old and is situated in the eastern coastal state in the east coast of peninsular India in the Bay of Bengal. So it is also India's pride, being Asia's largest brackish water lake. So here in this particular map, you can see that the lake in the state of Orissa, it is surrounded with 3 major districts. And here you can see that how the lake is quite rich with its ecological importance. Not only that, it also supports more than 1 lakh of these fishermen and contribute to India's foreign exchange balance through tourism and exports of prawns and fish. So there are 3 traditional villages around the lagoon. So I don't want to go further in the description of the demographic perspective of this particular study, the reason. So the most important factor for examining this environmental justice and investment in the poor framework is that the fishers are the caste-based, and fishery consists of traditional fishery groups. So therefore, on the basis of that, what are the factors responsible for as the drivers of marginalization of the species and the livelihoods? So here you can see there has been a major development in this particular lake, that is the dredging of the new mouth in the year 2000. I will come little later in my findings and analysis. So coming directly to the findings and analysis, so the first is what are the factors responsible for the ecological degradation and drivers of marginalization of fishers. So my own PhD work is also based on the strong people's movement Chilika in the 2006, and then I reworked on this particular reason and the various issues in 2015 and 16, and very recent 2021 and 22. So so historically, if we just go back to the drivers, there is a very strong political economy of shrimp aquaculture in the context of Chilika. So here the aquaculture leads to the loss of access rights and the customer institutions. So, but in the year 2000, there is the dredging of a new sea mouth. Here in this picture, you can see that this is the new sea mouth which was opened in 2000, and from the old sea mouth to new sea mouth, it is this particular distance. It is like the dredging of the sea mouth in front of this particular village is called Sipakuda. Is the major problem, because the new sea mouth whether it brought about any significant changes which are favorable to the coastal ecology and benefits to the fisher, that is the major question. So there are studies which have shown that hydrological intervention in the form of this dredging of the new sea mouth has created a path towards marginalization and disposition of fishers. So particularly this hydrological intervention, if you consider the benefits attributed to the new sea mouth. But in my own personal experience, whenever I have visited to the region, and very recently also in December 2021, I came across the responses of the villagers. They said that this hydrological intervention was almost universally disparaged by the fishers. So I was repeatedly told by them that this new sea mouth was an economic and ecological disaster for these communities. So how all this particular process, it accelerated the problem of further marginalization. So if you just relate it with the broader perspective of blue revolution and its discontents, this acceleration, it also leads to the problem of marginalization through the loss of fishing grounds, construction of prawn ponds in the near shore areas, choking of the channels, and conflicts between the communities. So here, so particularly here, even here Dr. Nayak's work also shows this particular fact. The stream ponds and the embankments. This is the picture of the stream ponds and the embankments, the artificial embankments which are created by the non-fishers in the particular locality. So shrimp aquaculture continues, but even today, and it started after 1994 by the outsiders. Even today, it's still continuing. So these are some. This is the stream ponds, and this is a very old picture taken during 2005 and 6. But the showing these two pictures is that how still it works. This particular development is still existing in the area in the form of the artificial stream ponds. So these are the environmental consequences of stream ponds. by using protein feed, it leads to pollution activity, and due to commercial standpoints, fresh water is insufficient to meet the household needs of the people, the irrigation, and so on and so forth. These are the socioeconomic impacts of stream farming. And if we just go to the final analysis, like how the changes in the livelihood features, it leads to occupational displacement and out migration. So out migration, it became a trend since 1991. It has been witnessed in the livelihood since 1991. So there are two drivers particularly lead to out migration: agricultural development, seamouth opening. So the current issue of migration, it is a kind of reverse migration during the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown in phase 1 and phase 2. So here the key issues is migration is that how the reverse migration, it has led to environmental distress during the pandemic in the study areas. In the study areas, it has also been looked at. So finally, just quickly give me running the batteries down. I'll just charge it. Sorry. So finally, if we just link the field observations with the study findings with the broader objectives, so the marginalization of fishes, I have like deployed it within the broader concept of environmentalism of the dispossessed. So I have justified this through the scholarly argument put by Temper in his thesis, the term which he referred as environmentalism of the dispossessed. Sorry, and I have also used the case of disposition of small-scale fishes in Chilica that fits with Harvey's concept of accumulation by disposition. So, which represents, the Harvey's attempt to update Marx's concept of primitive accumulation. So, according to Harvey, primitive accumulation is not a one-off process that happened in the emergence of capitalism, but it is an ongoing process. So the study here illustrates the marginalization of fishes through Marx's concept of primitive accumulation, as well as Harvey's accumulation of disposition in rural ecological spaces. And finally, the disposition process in Chilica is also, yeah.
We are at time, actually.
Okay.
Yeah,
yeah. So concluding this presentation, environmental justice, it lies at the heart of environmentalism. So the goals of environmentalism for social justice and vice versa. So therefore, on this question, like, does environmentalism promote injustice for the poor? My argument here goes with the assertion that despite the different conceptual underpinnings and prioritized values of the two concepts, there are inherent conflict between the goals of environmentalism and environmental justice. So only the need is that there is an approach of ecological justice and social-ecological integrity for sustainability of livelihoods of SSF in the post-commons. And I would like to conclude by referring this last point that to meet the session objective from B to B, the presentation introduced a conceptual framework of environmental justice and socio-ecological integrity for sustainable livelihoods. And this study also defines the way the social and cultural aspects of fisheries, drawing the implications of the traditional practices for securing food and livelihoods among the local communities, and emphasizes the significance of such practices in maintaining equity and cultural identity of small-scale fishers and sustainability of coastal resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Samista. Unfortunately, we are exactly on dot at the time.
Yes. Thank you, Prateep. Yeah.
No, it's not we had a lot of presentations, but I'm not sure whether the organizers would give us more time or not. But I think they're asking us to end the presentations in the session right here.
Not an issue, Prateep. Yeah.
What I would suggest to our audience is, if you have any questions or any clarifications, or you want to engage with any of the speakers that spoke in the last 1.5 hours, please get in touch. You can get their emails from the presentations, which are recorded and would be available on the WSFC website. And we look forward to engaging with all of you in future in another platform. I don't see any questions though. But I would like to bring this to an end with a huge thank you to all the 7 presenters who have shown that the types of vulnerability, the types of marginalization processes in small-scale fisheries could be many, but at the same time there are different responses, there are different ways in which small-scale fisheries are trying to deal with this. And the example of small-scale fisheries continue to survive and respond to odds and problems during the COVID-19 pandemic is something that is kind of very encouraging and shows what is the future of small-scale fisheries in terms of various strengths in the communities itself. So I will bring to this to an end. Again, thanks to the audience for listening to the talks, and unfortunately we didn't have time to engage. But again, so this is just the beginning of a large discussion, and we look forward to continuing this into the future. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks.